Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, let me begin by saying this. We are living through a moment that historians will one day look back on as a turning point in the global balance of power. The title before us, China warns U.S. on Venezuela power shift exposed, is not just a headline. It is a mirror reflecting a deeper truth. We are watching in real time the unraveling of an old order and the emergence of a new one. The United States, long accustomed to dominance in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine, now finds itself confronted by a rising China, asserting influence in places once deemed untouchable by outside powers. The question that ought to grip every policymaker and citizen alike: how did we arrive at a point where Beijing, not Washington, is shaping the economic and political trajectory of Venezuela? And what does it reveal about the erosion of U.S. hegemony across Latin America? The reality is stark. China's entry into Venezuela is not a random choice. It is strategic, calculated, and deeply connected to the global contest for resources, influence, and an ideological direction. The United States, with its repeated history of interventions in Latin America, sees this as a threat. But to much of the region, wary of U.S. overreach, China offers loans, infrastructure, and a sense of partnership rather than dominance. China's strategic entry into Venezuela is not a sudden development, nor is it an isolated maneuver. It is part of a carefully calculated long-term strategy that Beijing has pursued across Latin America, and Venezuela represents one of the clearest examples of how China leverages economic statecraft to achieve geopolitical ends. The story begins with oil. Venezuela, despite its political instability and economic collapse, possesses the world's largest proven reserves of crude oil. For a nation like China, whose economic growth depends heavily on secure access to energy resources, Venezuela is not just another partner, it is a critical node in the supply chain of the future. What is striking here is not merely China's willingness to do business with a government heavily sanctioned and politically isolated by Washington, but its ability to transform that isolation into leverage. Where the United States saw risk and chose punishment, China saw opportunity and chose investment. The scale of Beijing's engagement cannot be overstated. Over the past 2 decades, China has poured more than 60 billion into Venezuela through oil for loan agreements, infrastructure projects, and development partnerships. These loans were not simply financial transactions. They were mechanisms of influence, binding Caracas to Beijing in ways that sanctions could never unravel. Consider the symbolism. While Washington cut off Venezuela from international banking systems and blocked access to global capital markets, Chinese firms were building highways, housing projects, and even telecommunications infrastructure. The contrast is stark. One superpower chose isolation, the other chose integration. Which message resonates more with the Venezuelan people? Which path builds loyalty and trust? This dynamic reveals a larger truth about the current geopolitical moment. China is not just competing with the United States on military or technological grounds. It is rewriting the rules of diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing's strategy is simple yet profound: provide what Washington refuses to give. Where the U.S. imposes sanctions, China extends loans. Where Washington talks of democracy promotion through pressure, China emphasizes sovereignty and non-interference. These principles resonate deeply in a region that has endured decades of U.S. interventions, coups, and coercive policies. The emotional hook here is powerful. Latin American nations are no longer content to be treated as Washington's backyard. They are actively seeking alternatives. And China, with its deep pockets and strategic patience, is ready to provide them. In Venezuela's case, the timing could not have been more advantageous for Beijing. The collapse of the Venezuelan economy, exacerbated by hyperinflation, corruption, and mismanagement, coincided with Washington's decision to tighten sanctions. That decision, intended to bring the Maduro government to its knees, instead created a vacuum China eagerly filled. The Chinese approach was not altruistic, of course, it was transactional. In exchange for loans and investments, China secured preferential access to Venezuelan oil and commodities. Yet, in the eyes of many Venezuelans, this was far preferable to the punitive measures imposed by Washington. The perception matters as much as the reality. China appeared as a partner while the U.S. appeared as a punisher. We must pause and ask ourselves, how sustainable is this model for Washington? How long can the United States claim to lead in the region when its policies drive nations into the arms of its rivals? Venezuela is not just about oil or loans. It is about symbolism. It signals to every country in Latin America that there is another option, another superpower willing to engage without the moralizing tone or the political preconditions that so often accompany U.S. aid. This is where the hook becomes sharper. If Washington continues down its current path, Venezuela will not be the exception. It will be the precedent. The strategic depth of China's entry into Venezuela goes beyond economics. It carries military, technological, and diplomatic implications. Chinese firms have reportedly helped modernize aspects of Venezuela's defense systems and provided technology for surveillance infrastructure. This is not merely about oil rigs and highways. It is about embedding Chinese influence in the very structures of Venezuelan governance and society. In doing so, China ensures that its role is not easily unwound, even if political leadership changes. This layered approach, blending economic assistance with technological integration, makes Beijing's influence resilient in ways Washington may have underestimated. Ultimately, what we are witnessing in Venezuela is the exposure of a broader shift in global power. The fact that Beijing is willing to stand openly against Washington's sanctions regime and in fact thrive because of it demonstrates the erosion of U.S. hegemony in its own hemisphere. This is why China's entry into Venezuela is so significant. It is not just about securing resources, it is about signaling to the world that the rules of engagement are changing. The United States may still wield enormous military and financial power, but China is showing that strategic patience, coupled with targeted economic engagement, can yield influence in ways that sanctions and threats cannot. The hook here and the message we cannot ignore is this: the backyard is no longer Washington's alone. The fence has been breached, and the neighbors are listening to new voices. When we examine the role of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, it becomes clear that Washington miscalculated the long-term consequences of its actions. Sanctions were meant to isolate the Maduro government, cripple its economy, and force political change. Yet, instead of achieving those aims, they have pushed Venezuela deeper into the orbit of China and other global powers willing to fill the void left by the United States. The strategy of economic punishment, repeated so often in U.S. foreign policy, has once again revealed its unintended consequences. Rather than weakening an adversary, it has weakened America's own influence. Here lies the paradox that should capture everyone's attention. Every time Washington tightens the screws, Beijing steps in with an open hand, reshaping the balance of power in the process. The logic behind sanctions was straightforward: cut Venezuela off from access to capital, reduce its oil revenues, and make governance so unsustainable that the political system would collapse or be forced to change leadership. But what Washington underestimated was Caracas's ability to find alternatives. For years, Venezuela has redirected its oil exports toward China, often through creative barter arrangements that bypass dollar-based systems. While American companies withdrew, Chinese firms expanded their role in drilling, refining, and shipping. Sanctions may have hurt Venezuela's people, causing shortages, hyperinflation, and economic freefall, but they also made China indispensable to Venezuela's survival. And in geopolitics, dependence breeds loyalty. That loyalty has come at the expense of U.S. influence in a region once considered America's exclusive domain. Here's the hook that should unsettle Washington's policymakers. Sanctions were supposed to isolate Venezuela, yet they ended up isolating the United States. By refusing to engage and by shutting doors, Washington effectively turned over the keys to Beijing. The more the U.S. punished, the more room China had to expand. It is a lesson in the limits of coercive power. Nations under pressure often look for alternative patrons, and in today's multipolar world, those patrons exist. In the Cold War era, isolation worked more effectively because few global players could defy Washington's dominance. Today, with China rising as an economic superpower and Russia eager to reassert itself, sanctions rarely produce isolation. They produce substitution. For the Venezuelan leadership, this substitution was not just about economics, but survival. China offered billions in loans, often structured as oil-backed repayment agreements, which gave Caracas both immediate cash flow and a long-term buyer for its petroleum. At the same time, Chinese investments in telecommunications, housing, and infrastructure projects provided visible, tangible proof that Venezuela still had powerful allies. In contrast, U.S. sanctions delivered empty shelves, fuel shortages, and the collapse of health and education systems. Ask ordinary Venezuelans which power seemed more supportive, and their answers would reflect not ideology, but experience. Sanctions failed to win hearts and minds because they inflicted pain without offering hope. China, whatever its motives, offered relief at a time when Washington offered only pressure. This creates a broader narrative that extends beyond Venezuela. Across Latin America, governments are watching closely. They see what happens when Washington imposes sanctions, economies crumble, populations suffer, and leaders turn to China for rescue. The unintended message is clear: defy the United States, and China will catch you when you fall. This perception, whether entirely accurate or not, reshapes political calculations across the region. Leaders who once feared U.S. Retaliation now consider that retaliation less dangerous because Beijing's safety net looks increasingly reliable. That is a profound shift in the psychology of power, one that sanctions themselves helped accelerate. Moreover, the sanctions strategy has weakened Washington's moral credibility. By imposing broad restrictions that disproportionately hurt civilians, the U.S. appears not as a champion of democracy, but as a punisher of populations. China, meanwhile, couches its engagement in the language of sovereignty and respect, claiming it does not interfere in internal affairs. For nations long weary of U.S. interventions, this language resonates powerfully. It does not matter that China's policies are also self-serving. What matters is the contrast. And the contrast could not be sharper: a punishment versus partnership, isolation versus integration, coercion versus cooperation. The real danger for Washington is not just that its sanctions failed in Venezuela, but that they have become a case study in strategic miscalculation. Policymakers in Beijing have learned to exploit these opportunities, turning U.S. economic pressure into geopolitical openings. The longer the sanctions persist, the deeper Venezuela's reliance on China becomes, and the harder it will be for Washington to reassert influence in the future. The hook, the takeaway that should ring alarm bells in Washington is that sanctions no longer carry the same weight in a world where alternatives exist. They may inflict suffering, but they do not guarantee compliance. Instead, they accelerate the very power shift the U.S. seeks to prevent. For nearly 2 centuries, U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere has been guided by the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that Latin America is a sphere of influence reserved for Washington, off limits to external powers. It was a declaration born in the 19th century, but enforced repeatedly in the 20th through coups, interventions, and economic dominance. Yet today, as China asserts itself in Venezuela and across the region, the very foundation of that doctrine is being called into question. The United States can warn, sanction, and pressure, but its monopoly of power in Latin America has eroded. The hook is the Monroe Doctrine, once a symbol of uncontested authority, now stands as a relic of a bygone era, exposed and weakened in real time by the shifting global balance. This unraveling is not the result of a single event, but a cumulative process. The rise of multipolarity, the failures of U.S. interventions, and the growing appeal of China's economic model have converged to undermine Washington's claim to exclusive authority in its so-called backyard. Venezuela is not an anomaly. It is the clearest case of a broader pattern. when Washington tried to enforce dominance through sanctions and isolation, China stepped in with investment and partnership. The doctrine that once promised to keep external powers out now seems incapable of doing so. And in fact, U.S. actions have accelerated the entry of its rivals. This irony, this reversal of intent, should alarm anyone still clinging to the idea of American hemispheric supremacy. The erosion of the Monroe Doctrine is also deeply symbolic. For decades, Washington could rely on its military and economic superiority to deter outside powers from engaging Latin America. That credibility has waned. The wars in the Middle East, the rise of Asia, and domestic political turmoil have drained Washington's capacity to maintain unchallenged dominance. Meanwhile, Latin American nations themselves have grown more assertive, less willing to accept dictates from the North. China's entry into Venezuela is not just tolerated in many circles, it is welcomed as a counterbalance to U.S. overreach. The very nations once subject to Washington's heavy hand are now inviting Beijing in. What makes this development even more striking is the shifting perception within Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine was never popular among the nations it sought to control. It was seen as an imperial edict, not a protective shield. Today, with China's rise, those nations feel they finally have leverage, that they can negotiate with multiple powers, play one against another, and escape the suffocating embrace of a single hegemon. This is where the hook cuts deep. Latin America no longer views itself as Washington's backyard, but as a region with choices. And choice in geopolitics is power. Consider the contrast between the US message and China's message. Washington insists on framing its policies in terms of threats, warning nations of what will happen if they turn to Beijing, punishing them when they resist U.S. preferences. China, by contrast, arrives with offers of infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and loans framed as partnerships. The reality of these deals may be more complex, but perception is everything. In Caracas, in Buenos Aires, in Santiago, the appeal of a new partner who does not dictate domestic policy is profound. The Monroe Doctrine's language of exclusion feels outdated when nations are seeking inclusion in a broader global order. There is also a generational shift at play. Younger leaders and populations in Latin America are less influenced by Cold War narratives and more focused on development, technology, and opportunity. They are not interested in being pawns in a geopolitical chess game. They are looking for tangible benefits that improve daily life. China's engagement, whether through 5G networks, railways, aid, or loans, speaks directly to those aspirations. The U.S., stuck in a punitive mindset, continues to speak the language of the past. And here lies the most critical hook key. History will not wait for Washington to adapt. If it clings to the Monroe Doctrine as its guiding principle, it will find itself talking to a world that has already moved on. Venezuela is thus not just about Maduro or oil or sanctions. It is about the visible collapse of a framework that defined U.S. Dominance for generations. When Beijing openly challenges Washington in Latin America and finds willing partners, the old logic of hemispheric control no longer applies. the doctrine that once closed the door on outside powers now swings wide open, and the United States lacks the leverage to shut it again. The exposure of this vulnerability is one of the clearest signs yet of a shifting international order. The world is watching, Latin America is deciding, and the Monroe Doctrine is fading into history. We are witnessing the emergence of a multipolar world, and Venezuela is one of the clearest stages where this transformation is playing out. For decades, the United States could act with the assumption that its power was unrivaled, that its decisions would dictate the course of global affairs, especially within its own hemisphere. But that assumption is crumbling. China's role in Venezuela is not an isolated incident. It is a visible marker of a broader reality in which multiple powers are competing for influence, resources, and ideological space. The hook is sharp here. The age of U.S. unipolar dominance is fading, and Venezuela is exposing just how quickly that shift is accelerating. To understand this change, we need to step back and consider the world order after the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States emerged as the sole superpower. Washington believed it could shape the politics of every region, enforce economic rules, and deploy military power at will. For a time, it succeeded. But the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the growing confidence of regional powers like India, Brazil, and Turkey have steadily chipped away at that unipolar moment. Venezuela, caught between U.S. sanctions and Chinese investment, has become a symbol of how power no longer flows from one center, but from many. China's engagement with Venezuela demonstrates the appeal of this multipolarity. For Venezuela's leaders, Washington's punitive measures offered no path forward. Beijing's model, however, offered loans, trade, and infrastructure development without political lectures. Russia, too, played its part, providing military assistance and oil industry expertise. These alliances showed Caracas that it did not have to surrender to U.S. pressure. It could survive and even maneuver by leaning on multiple partners. This is the heart of multipolarity, the ability of smaller nations to diversify their alliances to resist domination by one superpower by balancing relationships with several others. For Latin America as a whole, this realization is profound. The multipolar shift is not just geopolitical, but psychological. For decades, nations in the global south felt there was no alternative to USD-led systems. Now, they see options. They can join China's Belt and Road Initiative, deepen energy ties with Russia, or explore regional alliances that lessen dependence on Washington. In Venezuela's case, this has meant trading oil for Chinese loans, inviting Russian military advisors, and opening channels with Iran. Each of these steps erodes the idea that the U.S. alone defines the political and economic future of the hemisphere. The hook is this: the more Washington tries to tighten its grip, the more Caracas demonstrates that alternatives exist, and alternatives weaken the myth of American inevitability. The United States still possesses immense power. Of course, its economy, military, and cultural influence remain unmatched by any single rival. But in a multipolar world, the comparison is no longer one against one. it is one against many. The combined influence of China's economic weight, Russia's geopolitical assertiveness, and the growing unity of regional blocs creates an environment where U.S. Dominance looks less permanent. Venezuela may seem small on the global stage, but it embodies the cracks forming in the old order. When Beijing can directly challenge Washington in Latin America without fear of serious retaliation, the message to the rest of the world is clear. The rules of power have changed. This changing landscape also creates risks. Multipolarity is not inherently stable. It can lead to competition and conflict as powers jockey for position. Venezuela could become a flashpoint where the rivalries of great powers play out with devastating consequences for its people. Yet at the same time, multipolarity offers opportunities for smaller nations to reclaim agency. Latin American countries, long constrained by U.S. dominance, can now imagine a role for themselves as active players in a diversified global system. This sense of empowerment explains why many governments in the region are cautiously engaging with China, even as they remain tied economically to the United States. The critical question is how Washington responds. Will it cling to the illusion of unipolar control, escalating confrontations in an attempt to reassert dominance? Or will it adapt to the reality of multipolarity, seeking cooperation where possible and respecting the choices of other nations? This is where the hook must strike. Denial of the new reality will only accelerate America's decline, but adaptation could allow the U.S. to remain a vital leader in a shared global order. The struggle over Venezuela is not just about one country. It is about whether the United States can recognize the end of its unchallenged supremacy and navigate the complex world that is now unfolding. Latin America today is in the midst of a profound recalibration, one that has been years in the making, but is now accelerating in plain view. Across the continent, governments and societies are searching for alternatives to a relationship with Washington that has too often been defined by dependency, intervention, and conditionality. Venezuela's embrace of China is not an isolated case, but a signal of a broader pattern that stretches from the southern cone to the Caribbean. The hook is undeniable. After decades of U.S. dominance, Latin America is learning to exercise choice, and in that choice lies the erosion of Washington's grip and the rise of new partnerships that promise development without dictates. For decades, U.S. influence in Latin America was maintained through a combination of economic leverage, security assistance, and political pressure. Aid and loans were tied to structural adjustment programs. Trade agreements often came with strings attached, and political alliances were expected to align with U.S. strategic objectives. While this system ensured Washington's dominance, it also generated resentment. Nations grew wary of being treated as junior partners or pawns in a broader geopolitical game. The yearning for sovereignty, for the ability to define their own economic and political paths, has been a consistent undercurrent in the region. The emergence of China as a willing partner has tapped directly into that sentiment. China's appeal lies not only in the scale of its investments, but also in the language with which it presents them. Beijing speaks of respect for sovereignty, of win cooperation, of infrastructure and development rather than austerity and reform. In practice, the deals may be complex and often heavily tilted in China's favor, but the optics matter for governments disillusioned by decades of IMF and World Bank conditionality. The idea of a partner who builds bridges, railways, and energy plants without demanding political concessions is attractive. The hook here is powerful. In the eyes of many Latin American leaders, Washington punishes while Beijing builds. That simple contrast resonates deeply. This is not to say that China's involvement is free of controversy. Critics in the region worry about debt dependency, about the long-term control China could exercise over key industries, and about the environmental and social impacts of Chinese projects. Yet, even with these concerns, the fact remains that Latin America is actively choosing engagement with Beijing. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, and Chile have signed onto the Belt and Road Initiative, expanding the scope of China's influence far beyond Venezuela. These choices reflect not naivety, but pragmatism. Leaders recognize the risks, but they also see the opportunity to diversify away from Washington's dominance. In a multipolar world, the ability to balance multiple partnerships is a form of protection as well as empowerment. The shift is also cultural and generational. Younger populations in Latin America, connected by technology and globalized economies, are less tied to the old narratives of Cold War alignment. They are looking for opportunities, jobs, infrastructure, digital connectivity that improve their daily lives. China, with its focus on technology transfers, telecommunications, and large scale infrastructure, speaks directly to these aspirations. The United States, by contrast, too often appears focused on controlling political outcomes rather than meeting developmental needs. This perception gap is crucial. Washington still sees the region through the lens of strategic rivalry, while Latin America increasingly views itself through the lens of economic opportunity and choice. We must ask the uncomfortable question: how long can the United States cling to influence in a region where its policies no longer resonate with the priorities of the people? The sanctions on Venezuela, intended to project strength, instead alienated ordinary citizens and deepened their suffering. China's investments, while self-interested, provided tangible relief and a sense of possibility. Multiply this perception across the region, and the shift becomes clear. Nations are no longer asking what Washington demands. They are asking what Beijing offers. That inversion of perspective marks a fundamental transformation. The search for alternatives is not simply about rejecting Washington. It is about creating leverage. By engaging with China, Latin American nations can negotiate with the United States from a stronger position, forcing Washington to compete rather than dictate. This perhaps is the most important hook of all. Latin America has discovered that in a multipolar world, it no longer has to choose submission. It can bargain, diversify, and demand respect. And once that realization takes root, the old asymmetry of power becomes impossible to restore. The deepening rivalry between the United States and China has placed Venezuela at the center of a dangerous geopolitical game, one that risks echoing the proxy conflicts of the Cold War. What began as a struggle over influence in a crisis-stricken country now threatens to spiral into a broader contest across Latin America. The warning signs are already visible. Washington's continued sanctions and pressure campaigns, Beijing's expanding economic and technological presence, and the willingness of Caracas to invite external powers as protectors against U.S. hostility. The hook here is chilling. Latin America, long scarred by foreign interventions, may once again become a battleground where global powers test their strength at the expense of local populations. For the United States, Venezuela is seen through the lens of security and ideology. The persistence of the Maduro government, despite years of economic collapse and political pressure, represents a direct challenge to Washington's credibility. If Venezuela can survive and even thrive through partnerships with China, Russia, and Iran, then U.S. influence looks fragile. That perception is precisely what Washington fears, and it is what could drive policymakers toward escalating confrontations. Already, there are growing discussions in Washington about countering China in the hemisphere, language that mirrors the rhetoric of containment strategies once applied to the Soviet Union. The danger is that the logic of the Cold War, seeing every gain by a rival as a loss to oneself, returns to dominate policy in the Americas. For China, Venezuela is more than just an energy supplier. It is a symbol of defiance against U.S. dominance and proof that Beijing can project influence into Washington's backyard. Chinese loans, oil agreements, and infrastructure projects are not simply about economics. They are about demonstrating that multipolarity is real, that the United States no longer holds uncontested sway even in its own hemisphere. The symbolic value of this cannot be underestimated. Each Chinese-built highway, each loan agreement, each shipment of oil reinforces the narrative that the old world order has shifted. And in this narrative, Venezuela becomes a front line in the larger struggle over the future of global power. The real risk lies in how this rivalry plays out on the ground. History tells us that when superpowers compete in third countries, it is often the people of those countries who suffer most. Venezuela, already battered by economic collapse and humanitarian crisis, cannot withstand a new wave of proxy confrontation. Yet that is precisely where the situation seems to be headed. Washington increases sanctions and pressures allies to isolate Caracas, while Beijing and Moscow strengthen their economic and military ties with the Venezuelan government. Each move invites a counter move, deepening polarization and raising the stakes. The hook here is stark. A nation desperate for stability may instead become the spark for instability across an entire region. Other Latin American nations are watching closely, and their choices will shape the trajectory of this emerging Cold War dynamic. If countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina lean further toward engagement with China, Washington may respond with heightened pressure campaigns dividing the hemisphere into camps of loyalty. That division risks undermining regional cooperation, weakening institutions like the Organization of American States, and replacing diplomacy with confrontation instead of building partnerships to solve shared problems like climate change, migration, or inequality. The hemisphere could be dragged back into a struggle of alignments where every nation is judged by whether it leans toward Beijing or Washington. This is not merely theoretical. It is already visible in subtle ways. Telecommunications contracts, port deals, and energy projects have become geopolitical battlegrounds. Washington warns against allowing Chinese firms like Huawei to build 5G networks, while Beijing promises faster, cheaper technology. Each of these decisions becomes loaded with geopolitical meaning far beyond its immediate economic or technological benefits. Venezuela shows the potential extreme of this process, a nation so enmeshed in the USC China rivalry that its sovereignty becomes a contested space. The danger is that others may follow, dragged into a rivalry they did not choose but cannot escape. The question that should haunt policymakers is whether this path is inevitable. Must Latin America become an arena of great power confrontation once again, as it was during the Cold War? Or is there still room to craft a more cooperative approach that respects sovereignty while avoiding escalation? The answer will depend on whether Washington can move beyond reflexive hostility and whether Beijing can demonstrate that its engagement is not simply another form of dependency. The stakes are high, and the warning could not be clearer. If the USA-China rivalry in Venezuela hardens into a full-blown hemispheric struggle, the region risks losing decades of progress to a new cycle of division and conflict. The hook is as urgent as it is sobering. Unless restraint and cooperation prevail, Venezuela may be remembered not as a nation that redefined sovereignty, but as the place where a new Cold War in the Americas began,